thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm going to hand you over to Ian. He's going to talk to us about lubricating. A few things to point out. If we need to exit, we can go out the door we come in, or you can get out this door here. There's another exit. The toilet's straight through at the back. And just to let folks know, as regards the heritage, Tuesday the 16th will be our last Tuesday open day before Christmas. There will be the usual ceilidh on the 2nd, and we'll be open from 3 o'clock here. And I'd like to thank anyone who was here and was at the ceilidh for your support on Saturday. It was lovely to see you. I don't think I've anything else to report, have I? I'll hand you over to Ian then. Okay?
Please, yeah.
All of that?
Yeah. Is that good? Is that okay, folks?
Yeah.
Can you hear me, yeah?
Yeah.
Oh, that's good then. Well, good evening and welcome to this wee talk about distilling in Sutherland and other parts of the country as well, but concentrating mainly on Sutherland. And we'll just crack on. Does anybody recognise this fine looking chap? Anyone want to hazard a guess who he is? Yes, you're right, it's one of the Jameses.
6th to the 1st.
King James IV. He was killed at Flodden Field on the 9th of September 1513, and he died at the age of 40 in battle, having fought to within a spear's length of the Earl of Surrey, who was the commander of the English army. He was the last monarch in Britain to die in battle, and you're thinking now, what's this got to do with whisky? But he ruled for 25 years, he built the Scots Navy, he was a patron of the arts, and he founded Aberdeen University. He also founded the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh. He commissioned Holyrood and Falkland Palaces. During his reign, the Education Act of 1496 introduced compulsory schooling. He ruled over a united Scotland, having defeated the Lords of the Isles. He brought the church under tight state control and doubled the Scottish economy under his reign. His downfall was to side with France against England, and a very anti-Scottish brother-in-law, Henry VIII, who, unlike his father, Henry VII, thought Scotland a mere vassal state. James broke the Long Peace, which was a 1502 treaty, and he invaded the north of England to support France. Unfortunately, a lot of veteran Scottish soldiers and artillerymen had sailed for France with the now formidable Scottish Navy that James had created. The Scots were comprehensively defeated at Flodden Field. So he was an excellent king, but the defeat at Flodden finished Scotland as a military power. But he did like a dram, by all accounts. So the first mention of whisky in Scotland is in the 1494 Exchequer Rolls of the court of King James IV. And as you can see, 8 balls of malt to Friar John Caw, wherewith to make aqua vitae. So the Latin phrase aqua vitae translates to water of life, which is the direct translation of the Scots Gaelic ushkava, an ancestor of the word whisky. So in ancient times, there was no record of distilled alcohol. There was fermented wine. The Romans drank copious amounts of wine. Beer and mead were also drank copiously and were favoured over water, as they were less likely to kill you. It's thought that the idea of distilling beer to produce a stronger spirit originated from ancient Arabia, where the distilling process was used to create perfumes. The knowledge possibly travelled back to Europe during the Crusades, but there is no recorded evidence before this entry in 1494. Now this little document, I'm sorry it's quite hard to make out, but it's the preface to an 1887 whisky guide, and the interesting part to draw from this is the fact that at this time, when Britain was the leading industrial power in the world and at its imperial zenith, the main source of revenue to the treasury was the production of Scotch whisky, which is quite a fascinating fact, considering we were such a leading industrial power back at that time. By the mid-1600s, Scotland was taxing whisky at 2 shillings and 8 pence per pint. By the time of the Act of Union, 1707, the same taxes applied to both parliaments. But by 1715, an English malt tax was imposed on Scotland and further increased in 1725. And this was a contributing factor to several riots and one of the long-standing grievances which led to the 1745 Jacobite uprising. But even with heavier taxes, the industry continued to prosper. One of the earliest and most prominent malt distillers was Tosh, which is on the Black Isle. Now, it wasn't one distillery, several small stills were producing on lands owned by the Forbes clan. The owner was Lord Duncan Forbes of Culloden, and he was a staunch supporter of King William of Orange, who took the British throne in 1689. Furious Jacobites burned down the distilleries and ran amok over the Black Isle that same year, whereby they sacked the Forbes estates and crops and destroyed the whisky stills. As a result, Forbes was granted a tax break for his support of King William, which gave his newly rebuilt stills a huge and unfair advantage over his rivals. Sources say Tosh whisky was of very high quality, and distilling continued on the lands of Tosh until the 1820s. And in modern times, we've got Glenwivis Distillery near Dingwall, which is once again producing whisky. Storm clouds gathered in 1757. Years of bad harvests followed, and the government was forced to ban the sale of spirits for 3 years. Illicit distilling took off on a huge scale. And of course, at this time, as an aside, the humble turnip grew in quantities and importance, and Robert Burns, who was employed as an excise man, would go on to lament and celebrate whisky in his poetry. Thee Tosh, oh sadly lost, Scotland laments from coast to coast. Now colic grips and barking host may kill us all, for loyal Forbes' chartered boast is taken away. Of course, we celebrate Burns in modern history by eating turnip as part of the celebrations. But that's for another time, that story about how important the turnip became. So by the time the government ban was lifted, the illicit trade was really flourishing and no one was keen to pay tax. And another increase in duty just made matters worse. It seems like the government were too slow to recognise that things were getting out of hand, and excise officers, like Robert Burns, were simply too soft on those caught in the act of illicit distilling, with early records of some individuals being caught 3 or 4 times in a short space of time. And by the time the authorities really got a handle on the scale of the problem, the whisky horse had bolted and the government were desperately trying to close the stable door. Now, this is an image, I think it's from Argyllshire, taken in the late 1800s. This shows, it shows that the independent spirit of the Highlander was still alive and well. And we can see here the little copper still, and this is known as the worm. And out of the bottom of that worm, after the distillation, where the steam condenses back to liquid, you would be getting at least 70% proof new make spirit. Now, if you look here, I don't know if that's a bottle of beer or a bottle of whiskey that chap's drinking, but it's quite a unique image, because most of these little copper pot stills were well hidden, and probably there's thousands of them still hidden in parts of the country and buried in peat bogs. And now, thanks to John Mackay, who can't be here tonight because he's got a very bad cold, for the following few pictures. I just found out tonight there were obviously probably hundreds of stills in Sutherland itself. Alec Campbell, he did just inform me the night that there was one on his lands. Is that right, Alec? Dating back to possibly the...
Before 1809.
Yeah.
Before the elections.
Yeah. So
Then there between 1574 and 1809.
So before...
And we're taking whisky from there across the Dale over at Norway.
Before the clearances. Yeah. So this picture here that we're looking at, excuse the quality, I had to take screenshots on my phone in John's house the other day. This is the remains of an illicit still that belonged to a character known as Geordie Klein. And the ruins are about 4 miles from Binarman, looking towards the mountains of Caithness near the Gormloch. The Garvery Burn in the picture here eventually joins the River Brora at the Blackwater above Gordon Bush. So that's a wee picture. That's John there and his fellow adventurers. He said it was in the late 1980s that they went and had a look for the still. And you can see here, you go back to the previous picture, the still would have been in here, this would have been covered, and of course you've got your water supply, and all around you've got your fuel source, your peat, which would be dried out. Come in. No problem. Hi Dom, how are you? So yeah, going back, that's John and his fellow explorers. And this is a view from the Gormloch looking towards Caithness. That's Morven to the right there. So a very remote location for a still. And this is back to the Garvery Burn. Now, funnily enough, I was talking to my friend Ronald Mackay just on Sunday night over a dram, believe it or not. Ronald's family have crofted the Berrican area of Dornoch for 200 years, and I asked him if he had any knowledge of stills in the area, and he looked and smiled and said, better than that. He's aware of the copper worm that his forebears used that was sold by his father, quite a well-known character, Tag Mackay, to a Mr. Donald Grant Dornoch not that long ago. It might be in part of the exhibition in History Links in Dornoch. I need to go and find that out. But he informed me that there was actually a batch of spirit made only about 30 years ago, and it travelled to a pipe band trip to Orkney with the Cali band. So I was going to ask our chair if she can ask her husband if he remembers this, because I was away in the police at the time.
Mr. Monroe.
Maybe Ronnie Monroe might remember it.
I was on that trip. Something's coming back.
The apparently the batch was known as Gash's Choice.
Could be it.
Gash being a by name for anyone that's not familiar for their croft at Gashiki. So I'd love to have been on that trip. Now, this article was taken from the Inverness Courier archive of June 1823, and the numbers convicted are quite mind-boggling. If you want to read this little paragraph, at the Justice of the Peace Court held here at Inverness on June 1823, Tuesday last, for the punishment of offenders against the excise laws, nearly 400 persons from the districts of Aird, Strathglass and Urquhart were convicted and fined in small sums. Those detected in illicit distillation were generally fined in 20 shillings each, and for selling spirits without a licence, the general fines were 4 guineas. Now, the modern day equivalent of 20 shillings in 1823 is about £87 in modern money, and 4 guineas equates to about £350 in today's money. So basically, the people that were selling liquor without a licence were getting fined £350, but the folk that were making it were only getting fined £87. So you can see how it was worth their while. And as I said, that's just one court sitting, 400 offenders. So that gives an idea of the scale of illicit distilling. In 1823, a new Excise Act changed everything. Duty on Scotch whisky was cut by more than 50%, and many distillers decided that this was the time to legitimise their businesses. Now, the first Duke of Sutherland, Livermore Lotham, founded Clynelish, and I'm pretty sure he must have had access to insider information, as he was a member of Parliament, and Clynelish was built in 1819 and began production about 1822-23. However, smuggling did not stop. And because the duty on spirits in England was much higher than in Scotland, there was a huge market for smuggling whisky down to England. And as we can read here, some of the ingenious methods involve training dogs to swim across rivers with pig bladders full of whiskey in tow. And of course, there are stories of mule trains leaving Strathspey areas and heading down to Edinburgh, again loaded with whiskey. And the distillers themselves would travel in armed groups, and they would let off. Nobody was killed, but certainly gunshots were fired at excise officers, and gunshots were returned. And I think the excise officers were simply too scared to approach them, and who can blame them? And even up until the 1980s, it was normal for excise officers to live on site at the distillery. And as one distillery manager said, to be a distillery worker, you have to have a real, genuine love for drinking whiskey. But to be an excise officer, you have to have an even bigger love. Helmsdale, I don't know if anybody's aware that Helmsdale briefly had a distillery. First licensed to A&D Simpson in 1825. It didn't last very long. The company that subsequently bought it were sequestrated and in 1840, and the distillery was closed and dismantled. Perhaps the herring boom in Helmsdale and the Kildonan gold rush didn't take off until the 1860s, so maybe it was the case of the distillery being in the right place but at the wrong time. And of course it had the newly built Clynelish to cope with just down the road. But here's a ground plan of the distillery, and to give you an idea of where it is, this is the old coastal road in front of it that runs to Navadale, and that behind here is modern day Simpson Crescent area of Helmsdale. So it's down past the lobster ponds, as we call it nowadays. And apparently you can still find some bottles if you go digging round about in that area. Empty, I should hasten to add.
It's Helmsdale you're talking about.
So, this is a recent image of Brora Distillery, originally called Clynelish. We'll come to that in a wee minute. Now, if you just note the pagoda drying kiln, very typical of 19th century distilleries. Some of the warehouses here on the right were added late in the 19th century when production vastly expanded. Now, like most distilleries at the time, Brora had a dram bell. I think it was located in here. And it was rung, believe it or not, 3 times a day, a bit like in the Royal Navy. The workers received their grog ration. However, this wasn't watered down rum, but 100 proof new make spirit. Now, this practice continued well into the 1960s. I think, Ronnie, you might be able to confirm that. I believe that was the case. Yeah, Ronnie?
I arrived 72,
Yeah? All right.
but it was still the case then.
I do believe, yes. I think one of your relations might have been partaking in it. Yeah. So, as I said, this was built originally. This is now known as Brora. It was refurbished completely in 2020-21. But this was the original Clynelish. And this is the new Clynelish, as we call it. The original Clynelish was built in 1819. The new distillery was built in 1967. In 1912, James Risk bought out the distillery from partners along with the Distillers Company Limited, who became part of modern day Diageo, the present day owners. Another well-known brewer, local, Alistair Risk, he's a direct descendant of James Risk. In the 1960s, most of Clynelish's spirit was going into blends, and there was a big boom. People were buying more luxury items such as cars and whiskey. So they needed to really up the production levels. So the new distillery was built in 1967, and they ran side by side until they got the process right in the new building. and had perfected the taste. Then the older distillery was briefly mothballed. However, in the following years, Culila Distillery, which is on Isla, faced a drought and closed for a year while they did refurbishments. The owners, Johnny Walker, were missing peated whisky, especially for their black label blend, and needed something to use in its place. So Clynelish reopened the original distillery in May 1969 under the name Brora and started making Brora whisky. A little bit of the science: Brora's ppm levels, phenol parts per million, which describes the peat level used in the whisky, started at around 30 to 35, which is on a level with some heavily peated malts like Culila and Lagavulin. It was reduced for the modern day Brora single malts. So Brora went into the blends for a year whilst Culila was closed, and then continued to make the whisky as a single malt and ran until July 1983. Following closure, Brora whisky went up in price, and Brora today is one of the most prized whiskies you can buy. Their last release prior to 2020 was the bicentenary bottling to celebrate 200 years of production from 1819, and 1,819 bottles were produced. This Brora 200 currently sells for about £7,500 a bottle. The most expensive bottle of Brora was sold at a charity auction in 2023 for £400,000. And as I said, Brora was completely refurbished in 2021 and is producing again. We don't know when they'll release a new batch of Brora. I doubt it'll be for a few years yet. So Clynelish itself has had a strong connection with Johnny Walker blends, and as I said, around 95% of the spirit produced is used in Johnny Walker whiskies. And that's just a picture of the bar at Clynelish. I'm sure some of you will be quite familiar with it. I apologise for the cushions in the foreground. I took the picture when we were closed. I hesitate. I did work there for a few years. I'm retired from there now. This is the mash house at Clynelish. 8 wooden washbacks, as you can see here. They're made from Oregon pine, and between them they can ferment about 58,000 litres of beer, which is known as wash, and 12 tons of malted barley along with about 50,000 litres of water go into one mash to extract all the sugars. So this wash beer is then distilled into new make spirit, which will eventually mature into a fine single malt whisky. There are actually a couple of steel stills washbacks as well, but they're kind of used for extra capacity when it's required. So they're quite beautiful things, and quite awesome actually how they're constructed. Sorry about the quality of this pick, but it's some of the stills at Clynelish. Copper pot stills, they were all refurbished in 2016, and 2 have subsequently been refurbished. So they're basically giant kettles, brass kettles, and they're on pretty much 24 hours a day. So they can be filled with about 18 to 19,000 litres of distillate. There's 3 wash stills, 3 spirit stills, so it's double distilled, and the result at the end is a fresh sort of new make spirit with 67% alcohol content, and that gets put into casks and matured for at least 3 years. So this picture here is an old cask, but on top of it some very traditional distiller's tools for opening and dipping the casks. So dipping is part of customs and excise checks. So left to right we've got a mallet, and this is a dipstick. Don't do that, Rodney, you dipstick. Well, this is a measuring dipstick, and this is the dipper to extract the precious liquid, and this is a bung remover, and you just screw that end in and turn it, remove the bung, and then put the bung back in and hammer it with the blunt end. Basic tools, as old as distilling. And this is one of the warehouses at Brora, stroke Clynelish. There's still about 6,000 casks stored on site, containing some very old Brora and rare Clynelish whiskies. Most of the modern whisky that Clynelish produces is stored in central Scotland, in rather more modern warehouses than that. But for the purpose of maturing whisky, these old traditional warehouses are perfect because they've got earthen floors, stone wall construction and huge low slated roofs. So basically, even at the height of summer, it's nice and cold in here. So you've got the perfect conditions for maturing whisky. I'm sure you've heard about the Angel's Share. Well, that's basically evaporation. So in Scotland, a cask of whisky will probably lose about 2% of its content per annum, just down to evaporation. And that's known as the Angel's Share. And that's just a wee bottle of Clynelish. Now, thanks to my colleagues at Clynelish, when the ladies serve tea tonight, if anybody would like a little taster, there's a wee complimentary dram going to be handed out. Okay? Now, although Balblair, this is a wee picture of Balblair Distillery, it's not technically in Sutherland, it's in Ross-shire. It does fall within the Sutherland electoral ward. It's a great example of a very traditional distillery that's not changed very much in 130 odd years. It's now owned by Inver House Group, who also own Old Pulteney, Speyburn, Glenlivet, Knockdhu and Balmena distilleries. It was founded way back in 1790 by John Ross, and his family ran the business very successfully for over 100 years, until the late 1890s, when the distillery was bought over and rebuilt slightly further along from its original site, beside where its modern site is beside the railway line. However, the original water source was so good that the distillery chose to ignore a nearby burn in favour of the original Altdard burn. So to this day, the Balblair continues to use the original source of water. And I don't know if anybody saw the film The Angel's Share. This was the set for that film. Very funny movie. And on the back of that, Balblair opened a small visitor centre in its former Maltings building. And it's well worth a visit to see a small traditional Highland distillery. Now, going back to Sutherland and more modern times, Dornoch Distillery Company. This is the Thompson brothers, Simon and Philip. It was founded in 2013 as an independent bottler, and that meant that they made their own sort of concoctions from bottles, from casks that they bought in themselves. They began producing gin originally. They bought over this old 19th century fire station at the back of the Castle Hotel, and began producing gin, and they've built up quite a good reputation for themselves. Thompson Whisky is building a great name as a small batch distillery. They released a 6-year-old cask in 2023. As I said, they're already well known for their gin and blended malt whisky, and of course they've got a fantastic whisky bar in the Castle Hotel, and they also have a well-stocked shop at Station Square in Dornoch. And closer to home, Dunrobin Gin. Boban and Lizzie Costin have this year got Dunrobin Gin up and running. They operate from Dunrobin Farm. They've got a seasonal outlet and bar at Dunrobin Castle from April to October, the wee gin shop. And as the business grows, you'll be able to purchase from local outlets, and of course in due course Next year, Lizzie says the production of whisky will begin. For gin lovers, it's a very fine gin, and the outlet at Dunrobin offers some lovely cocktails, which makes a walk along the dairy park so much more enjoyable, as I can attest to. I think they're also selling online, yeah.
Leslie says they're going to be in the Stag's Head on Friday for
The,
the Christmas
the,
shopping.
the late night shopping, they'll be in the Stag's Head on Friday, that's correct. And funnily enough, they're located in the barns, the original barns at Dunrobin, and the date above the barns is the same as Clyneleash, 1819. Now, this is a new business venture, Gledfield Distillery in Ardguy. Sorry about the quality of this picture. It's been started by a former Clyneleash employee called Kira Bow. But a nice little story. Marjorie Macbeth was born in 1884 and lived in Strathkyle, Ardguy. Don't ask me to pronounce that. She was known as Red Marge, and there are great stories told of her illicit brewing and distilling. One day she was nearly caught when the excise men came on a horse and cart from Bewley. Fortunately, Marjorie was quick to hide her pot still somewhere no respectable officer would dare look, under her petticoats. So inspired by the story of her great-great-grandmother, Kira Bow founded Gledfield Distillery on the 14th of February 2022. So hopefully she'll make a go of it. And this is the old ice house at Ardguy where she's located the distillery. So that's our distilleries covered. But what about selling the product? Well, over the years, whisky's been advertised in many different ways. Johnny Walker was always ahead of the curve. So on the left, we've got an early 20th century advert. Quite a frightening looking cove here. I wouldn't let my daughter go out with them. And on the right, it's a mid 20th century. There's a bar ornament. I'm sure most of us have seen similar things in bars and increasingly in antique shops nowadays. And of course, the guy in the middle is the 21st century update. He's slimmer, fitter, less whiskey drinking, just altogether more handsome and younger. Now, this is just a bottle of Johnny Walker Red Label, quite an old bottle, but just to go about advertising and innovations. The square bottle, that is quite familiar to us all today, it was found to be more robust for long sea journeys. They were located in Kilmarnock and they sold to the tea clipper captains that were coming into Greenock. They were filling their empty tea chests, packing these bottles into straw tea chests, and they lasted better on long ocean-going voyages. They invented this angled label, and of course different colours, black label, red label, green label, blue label, etc., etc. Very distinctive. They made them easy to identify, even in a smoke-filled bar room when you were seeing three of them. And basically by the 1880s they were getting awarded so many sort of trade medals. They'd become a global phenomenon, and we can truly say that Scotland produced the first global company long before Coca-Cola or McDonald's and the like left the shores of the United States. So it's something to be quite proud of, Scottish industry. Now this is this is a 1902 advert, real shortbread tin romantic nonsense. Is that how people really thought we acted? This chap here would appear to be the tourist. He's got his pith helmet on, and they're quite well supplied. There's 1, 2, 3 bottles of whiskey on the go. Yes, it's just got everything really that is bad about shortbread tin Scotland. I believe Buntaskin is near Falkirk, and I think there might be a Buntaskin in Canada as well. And here's another early advert featuring 2 quite well sozzled coves. Again, they've got a bottle each. No real hints at responsible drinking here. And of course, branded water jugs were very popular forms of advertising. There's just a white horse jug there. Because you'll all have heard the old white horse joke, yes? A white horse walked into a bar. The barman says, "We have a whiskey named after you." The horse looked at him and said, "What, Albert?" So by the 1970s, things were getting a wee bit more sophisticated. We've got a good-looking couple here. They've both got a whiskey in hand. Certainly becoming more sophisticated and coming into more modern times. A modern Glenfiddich advert from the early 2000s. And again, some brands you don't really need to say what that is. You could do away with the writing, you'd know it. Just some advertising is absolutely fantastic. So, moving on to a few facts. Sorry, you might not be able to read much of this, but in Scotland, 44 bottles of Scotch whisky are shipped from Scotland to over 160 markets around the world each second. That's 1.4 billion bottles every year. Laid end to end, these bottles would stretch 11 times around the earth. In 2024, Scotch whisky exports were worth £5.4 billion. In 2023, Scotch whisky accounted for 74% of Scottish food and drink exports and 22% of all UK food and drink exports. That's how big it is. There's various other little figures here. More than 41,000 people are employed in the Scotch whisky industry. In 2022, there were 2 million visits to Scotch whisky distilleries and visitor centres, making them collectively the most popular tourist attraction in Scotland. There's about 22 million casks lying maturing in warehouses in Scotland. That's around 12 billion bottles of whisky. To be called Scotch whisky, the spirit must mature in oak casks in Scotland for at least 3 years. Some folks say 3 years and a day to take in leap years. And technically it must also be distilled in a copper pot still. There are currently 152 operating Scotch whisky distilleries in Scotland. That's as of June 2025. Scotland's oldest working distillery is the Glenturret, which is located in Crieff, and its earliest record goes back to 1763, and it's known for making handcrafted, very traditional processes, which include the use of a hand-operated mash tun. I can't imagine how hellish that must be to turn that by hand. Glenfiddich is our largest single malt distillery, with a capacity of 21 million litres pure alcohol per year. Campbellton Loch, I wish you were whisky. Well, there you go. Some other big ones: Glenlivet, Macallan, obviously, huge distilleries. Strathclyde is a lowlands distillery. It's got a huge capacity. It's a grain distillery, 39 million litres of alcohol. And Cameron Bridge, also in the lowlands, it's got a capacity of 110 million litres of pure alcohol, making it the largest grain distillery in Scotland. Saxa Vord distillery claims the most northerly title in the UK. It's up in Shetland. Previously it was 8 Doors Distillery, which was in John O'Groats. Bladnoch in Wigton is the most southerly distillery. And we were talking there about grains, and there's various different types of whiskies. When you talk about single malt distilled whiskies, single malt whiskies come from a single distillery. Single cask whiskies come from a single cask. Blended whiskies are a mixture of single malt and grain whisky. So grain whisky can be made from a variety. It doesn't have to be malted barley. It can be made from grains of corn, wheat, rye, along with malted or unmalted barley. It's quicker to make and bottle, and is often used as a base for famous blends like Grouse and Black Bottle, Johnny Walker, etc, etc, etc. So, without wanting to bore you too much more, I think we'll get to tea quite quickly and get you that wee dram So that just pretty much brings me to the end of this wee chat, and all I want to say is Slàinte. Here's to a long life and a merry one, a quick death and an easy one, a pretty girl and an honest one, a stiff whiskey, sorry, it's spelt the wrong way, a stiff whiskey and another one. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian.
All right.
Questions? Very, very interesting, Ian. Thank you.
There you go. Was that too much information?
No, no. You often wondered how the mission